So what they're saying now is something wasn't right with me. They knew, they said they knew I had sciatica and um, I was hurting. I was in pain. And yet they said they wanted me to work. So I'm wondering, what is it about them that wants to latch onto my working? And that's where I think this is coming from. I think it's coming from, and it's kind of dark out, but I'm going to lean back a little bit so it'll be harder to see me, but I'll do a video later where I show you my face. I think this is coming from them wanting control over my life. And the moment I'm not working, then they get upset. And I wonder why. But I think they said before that they were using me as a reference. They were coming to my jobs when I was working. They also probably were trying to steal my identity. So maybe that could be it. The other big deal that I want to make about that is when they're going over things and they're saying like, they said something recently this morning about whether I liked something when I was younger. Now, at 49, I'll be 50 in December. They are upset because if they're talking about something I may have liked when I was a little girl in the 80s, and they say, oh, why don't you say a little girl in the 70s? Well, I was born in 1973. So I did the chart that I've shown you guys before of the ages. So let me show you guys that again. Oh, everything's going to fall. Okay, so I showed you this chart of my age. So when we're talking about like the 1970s, my age, I would have been too young to really, and remember it'll be December as of that time. So it's not like 1973, it's like December 1973 I was born. So it would be December 1970 something. So we're talking about like, if we're talking about the 70s, I would have been like, what, 6 in December 1979. 6 in December 1979. So it really wouldn't make sense for me to talk about the 70s because I would have been too young to actually, like, what was I doing? I was like, December 1979, I would have been in first grade. So what about a first grader? You know what I mean? So when you're talking about what I would have been thinking and really developing, we would have to talk about the 1980s because, in December of 1973, I was born. So we're talking about the 80s. So when we're talking about the 80s and we're talking about me as a little girl, so say 1980 December. So most of 1980, I was 6. So what is a 6-year-old thinking? I mean, who cares really? Because I'm 6, So we're talking about the 80s. And when they're talking about what I was thinking in the 1980s, I wouldn't think the same thing as a 50-year-old woman. So I don't really even understand why that would make sense to go over that. But what they're saying is that maybe it makes sense to go over it because they want to cover up that they weren't doing this all along. Well, that does make sense. But then when you talk about what I was thinking at that age, you couldn't ask a relative of mine because that wasn't what I was thinking. It would make more sense to have asked me what I was thinking. So when they're talking about, well, you were thinking such and such, and they say, well, we know you were thinking that because your relative said that. They didn't ask my mother. A relative wouldn't know what a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, even a 10-year-old is thinking. And when they keep talking about specific years, in December 1983, I turned 10. So again, 40 years ago, I would have just been a 9-year-old about to turn 10. It goes back to my point that you would have to ask me. You can't ask someone else. You would have to ask me what I was thinking. So when they're talking about like stories and different things that a 10-year-old would say, you can't then apply it to today because it doesn't make sense. If you were watching me all along, then you would have had notes about what you thought, but you would have to speak to a 10-year-old me about what I thought. So now that they're trying to do this based on me in 40 years ago. It's hard because they're not understanding that you would have to set things in 40-year-old time. So you can't start saying, well, you thought such and such, when the technology that existed 40 years now didn't exist 40 years ago. Why would they lie? Like, why would they lie and say they were doing this all along when the technology wasn't invented? Why? Like, why would they lie? So that's what I want to title this video. Why lie? And why would they come up with this in 2016 based on someone who I haven't spoken to since 2011 and someone I hadn't seen since 1996? I don't understand. So another big deal that they wanted to talk about is trying to connect with me with people who I no longer wanted to connect with. Again, they just said two. They just said, I no longer want to connect to. That's wrong. And that's my point. Why lie? Why say this is about correcting my grammar when you folks have an issue with your own grammar? Why don't you correct your own grammar? Why spend so much time correcting me when you have your own issues? And that's my point. Like, what is the point of doing it? At one point, they said that they, were trying to read along when I'm reading to help teach people how to read. That doesn't make sense. Again, it doesn't make sense. So if you have an issue reading, why wouldn't you do what you need to do to teach yourself how to read instead of trying to read along with me, which makes it harder for me to read and harder to read correctly? So what they've been doing is trying to make my head hurt here and behind my the bottom of my neck right here. Let me move forward so you guys can see back here, so that when I'm doing something, I'm focused on the pain and then I forget what I've done. So in some of my videos, you'll hear me say the exact same words over again. So it does affect the memory. And going back to how that would work is that if I can't remember something I just did, like I'm saying the same words exactly within the short amount of time, how do they expect me to remember something that happened in 1976 when in 1976 I was 2, I didn't turn 3 until December? I wouldn't remember. So we're not talking about a 2-year-old. Like, could you imagine, like, I'm sitting here, barely remember what I just said, but I'm like, at 2 years old in 1976. No. So then we go to 1977, and I'll take it each year. Let me just show you guys this. So then we go to 1977. So 1977, I was 3. Do you really think I'm going to start talking about things that happened when I was 3 years old? In 1978, I was 4. Do you really think I'm going to start explaining to folks, well, in 1978 when I was 4? In 1979, I was 5. Again, how would I start talking about 1979? I wouldn't. So what I'm saying is that it seems like the people who wrote notes started writing notes about me, but they wrote it based on what they felt, not based on me. So if I'm a 5-year-old, you would have to sit down with 5-year-old me and start having a conversation. And what would you get? You get a conversation with a 5-year-old. So they said, I used to say, children are little people, not, in any other way than they're humans. They're humans, smaller humans. And they said, well, they're children. But isn't a child a human? So when you say a little human, person, people,